I think that's what I'm going to do now is visit, because I know this is in-service training and it's supposed to be educational and so forth and so on. But I'm going to give you a break from the educational component of it, and we're just going to have a little bit of fun, if that's all right, because my experience has been an enjoyable, lifelong search, I guess, for something that I like to do. You know, and all the points I was going to make pretty much have all been covered. We've gone through most of the things and the issues and discussed them, and I like that. I know John Fike was explaining to us earlier that, let's see, I want to make sure I got it right so that you get the educational component of this down. If you have toxic plants, you know, like maybe acorns or black locusts and different things, if you have toxic plants in your silvopastoral system that you're dealing with, you need to drink a beer tonight. Did I get that straight? I'm pretty sure I heard what he said that we needed to do. I certainly do applaud the title of this meeting, Silvopasture Boon or Boondoggle. Who came up with that? Raise your hand. Chris, okay. The reason I think it's so good is because once in a while you need to step back and look at where you are and see if things are going your way, you know, and how, if you're doing the right things and helping to help out. And I think you are doing the right things here. And we're all in search of experience. As you know, experience is what you get when you don't get what you wanted to get. And the guy on the left, these three people, does anybody in the room know who all of these three people are? Can you name all three of them? 2 out of 3? Best 2 out of 3. Okay. On the left is Clifford Lewis. Clifford was a pioneer in silvopasture in the southeast. Clifford worked around Florida and Georgia and around the southeastern U.S. Terry Clayson is in the middle. Dr. Clayson had a very nice and very large silvopastoral complex there with Louisiana State University, and a wealth of knowledge on how to get the most out of silvopasture. We worked with double row plantings, block plantings, thinned 3-row plantings with the concept of the middle row not having limbs, and you don't have to, and so forth and so on. And actually, in that particular instance, that didn't work out all that great. It seems like a good concept. You know, you don't have to prune. Then you harvest your outside rows for pulp, you know, at a given time, and then your inside row is your leaf trees, and the problem was they were a whole lot smaller than the outside trees for obvious reasons. And then on the right-hand, lower right, is Jim Robinson, and Jim Robinson is an agroforester. All of these guys, I guess, are retired. Huh. Nearly all of my friends are. I hadn't really thought about that too much. But Jim worked in Texas, Arkansas, places like this. I spent many years with Jim going around the countryside looking at silvopastoral complexes and trying to figure out how to make them work and put them in. I guess my experiences with silvopasture have been rewarding, inspiring, sometimes a little fuzzy, but very seldom black and white. So I want to mention that some silvopasture concepts are very, very old. And this, once again, this is something that's been discussed. And I remember in the late 80s and 90s, we were kind of arguing and haggling over some of the terms like silvopasture, silviculture, silvopasture, timber pasture. That was Terry's favorite. Some others, and finally, the National Agroforestry Center allowed us to settle on the use of silvopasture. Somebody else had coined in the past, and you can see the little inset document there that we put out there first, the publication on silvopasture, which I think we've learned a lot. And while you can't really categorize everything, nothing is as neat as it seems. There's always a gradient in between things. I would like to, your indulgence, I would beg your indulgence to use these 3 categorizations today, or at least for the next 25 minutes. And let's look at forest grazing and silvopasture and turning cattle into woods. We've talked about all three of those kind of today. Forest grazing is a conservation practice or best management practice, if you're of that persuasion, that's utilized in a lot of parts of the world, and it's applicable here as well, but honestly it's probably not going to be utilized a lot in the mid-Atlantic region unless some of the secondary values become more elevated, bird habitat, other mammal habitat, different things. Forest grazing is, do you know the difference, as at least the way our agency, my agency, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, formerly Soil Conservation Service, the way we look at things is we have range management, we have pasture management, and we have forest grazing. Forest grazing is an ecological method of managing the landscape where you're using grazing systems, deferment, fire in a natural ecosystem. And some of the things you're trying to do include forest stand improvement. Obviously, FSI is a common practice in all forests. Grazing deferments, I guess I shouldn't say all forests, all managed forests. Grazing deferments, prescribed fire, natural regeneration. Natural regeneration is a factor that a lot of y'all have kind of touched on. The management of livestock in a system where you're going to have natural regeneration can be a little tougher depending on the species that you're trying to elevate in the ecology of the site. And so the way it's done is by keying on these the forage preference values by wildlife and livestock, and figuring out what values are going to be implemented or taken, which of those plants are going to be removed from the site at a given grazing pressure. At full grazing pressure, everything's removed, right? There's nothing left. And so then once again, there's that gradient up to where with one cow on 800,000 acres, you don't have very much removed. And so that's the way these forest grazing sites are managed. And again, they're typically not done correctly, but if it's not done correctly, then we don't have forest grazing. Same thing, I guess, could be said about silvopasture, perhaps. Looking at the top there, the little red things, and I don't have glasses, but anyway, silvopasture is another land management type as opposed to forest grazing. Forest grazing, again, was ecologically managed. Silvopasture is more agronomically managed. We've talked about fertilizing, we've talked about lime, we've talked about stumping. We've talked about all these aspects basically that are not ecological concepts, they're agronomic. So silvopasture is intentionally established. In other words, it's not just something that's there and you figure out how to use it as best as you can. It's intentionally established, it's integrated fully. It's with an interactive relationship between understory and the overstory. Then you have, it's also intensively managed for the canopy. You're basically managing the canopy for the grass or the forages, and you're managing the livestock for the canopy and the competition that would very commonly be in there. The photographs you see, these are all, everything you're going to see in these pictures, I guess I've either had something to do with or planted them on our own farms. And let me be frank up front, my farms that you're going to see these photographs on are fairly much postage stamps type farmettes, hobby farms with different terms. In California, it's a ranch, okay, but here these are small farms. Our Florida farm was 42 acres. It was a loblolly primarily issue. Our Alabama farm was like 110 acres. Our Kentucky farm is 85 acres. These are not big, large, organized silvopastoral systems. But I will tell you an example of working with, and we've talked about working with some of the non-traditional or maybe the more traditional timber management companies. And here's an example. I worked with Lon Calla. You don't know probably. Lon Calla is London Ocala. It's a Florida. It's a British and Central Florida and parts of Alabama and Georgia based company. Lon Calla being London and Ocala. And so the general manager happened to live in the town where I lived and went to our church, in fact. And so I had an opportunity to get with him one time in 1989-ish. I believe it was 89. Bill Ellington, we went out with Bill, and we looked over all of the holdings that they had in Central Florida, because he was listening as I was proclaiming some of the concepts of silvopasture that I didn't really understand all that well, but I was kind of interested. And I could see, I had read books on agroforestry that we talked about that land equivalency value that earlier, and what I've seen in the books and in the press was that the land equivalency values are somewhere between 1.05 and 1.54. But there weren't any negatives. I mean, you have more product produced when you harvest the overstory and the understory than you do from just one or the other. On the left, you see a longleaf pine, Bahia grass, fescue, ladino crimson, that we established in 2000 in Americus, Georgia, at the Plant Material Center. And we researched that Mary Miller Goodman and some others, one of my kids, and they looked at this from a standpoint of forage quality, light penetration, some of those issues. In the middle is the Solon-Dixon Research Center. If you're familiar with that one, down in kind of southern Alabama, it's part of the Auburn University program. Up in the top, you see where we established these two-row sets 10 feet apart between the longleaf pines and with a 40-foot alley between them. In fact, they just had the photo just below that is where they had I wasn't there. I sort of lost touch when I left Alabama, but that was the latest research setting that they had, just kind of like what we're doing here today. And over on the right is a white pine cool season grass silvopasture that I have on our farm in Kentucky now. Well, silvopasture is intensive, integrated, and intentional. The management inputs, remember the management inputs on the forest grazing? Can y'all name them? Prescribed fire, or prescribed burning, if you please. And grazing management based on, do you remember? Forage preference values. So, and browse. And, but the management inputs for silvopasture are significantly more, and they're agronomic. We're dealing with canopy management, tree protection, weed control, soil amendments, hay harvest, tree pruning, rotational grazing, pasture renovation, and grazing management based on the total forage production, not just preference values to glean. In other words, so we're going from like a typical range in forest grazing might be one animal unit per 25 to 60 acres, whereas with it's real common in silvopasture to have total carrying capacity rates of maybe 3 acres per animal unit to 12 or something like that. So they're at a whole different scale. Those are just none of that's, don't write any of those numbers down. Realize you have to calculate them out based on either the forage preference value or, in this case, the total forage production. The results from silvopasture are a diversification of income stream, shorter rotations, shaded cool season forage plants can be more nutritious, improved plant nutrition uptake, high value woodland product from active limb management, cooler environment in the summer for livestock, that one goes pretty much universally, and then some wind and weather protection. But the big ones here basically are that we recoup return from is the shorter forest rotation, which this gentleman over here, he's gone, was asking about that earlier, about, he stepped out apparently. Anyway, that's too bad. And Okay, then the third, the third practice that I want to mention is turning livestock into the woods. This is not a best management practice. This is not a conservation practice that NRCS has or advocates for or anything. This is a practice that's employed a lot of the time. Has anybody here seen where you're just turning cattle in the woods? Would you raise your hand? Okay. 93% and the rest are liars. Okay. You've seen people just turn cattle into the woods. Why in the world would you do that? Is there a reason to do that?
Usually it's in the summertime, your pastures are burning up or eaten up, and that's the only place there's forage.
That's right. That's an excellent reason to do it. Does that reason counterbalance some of the effects that you have? Okay, it can be a brief temporary system where it's in balance and you have, okay, we've had cattle in all over the farm or whatever, and we've managed them and we've used them, and tomorrow the heat index is going to be 106, you know, and they're saying, you know, we're talking about dead animals, we're talking about all kinds of things. So I've got this wooded location that I can turn my cattle in there from 2 to 6 tomorrow, and then maybe 2 to 6 the next day, and then the next day, and then I can move on to the next pasture. Well, that's reasonable, but it's not a conservation practice. It's just opportunistic use of the landscape that's not harmful in those circumstances. So brief and temporary, we're talking about, if you're going to do this, then you need to monitor the ground cover and soil moisture, because you only want to be turning in when the ground is frozen or dry, you know, relatively dry, so you don't damage anything. Short-term access only, requires fencing, deferring the sites when wet, and protecting sensitive, valuable trees. I mentioned specifically fence in this one. We talk about fence here because this is a system that often people would say, yeah, I've got 14 acres of wooded area over in the back of this pasture. That's just part of the pasture, and the cattle can go over there and enjoy the shade. Well, they don't go over there and enjoy the shade for a short time and with controlled access and so forth and so on, and they don't defer from being in there when it's wet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and they don't protect the tree species. Cattle aren't real good at doing that for you. So that's why those management inputs are required. So it's a lot of inputs for the benefits that you get, but some of the results can be ground coverage maintained and compaction avoided if it's briefly utilized, only when it's dry or frozen. You can have some wind and weather protection there, cooler environment in the summer for livestock. There can be low quality roughage available for dry cows if it's carefully managed, and then reduced invasive plant competition. Grazing is not a bad thing when you have a kudzu forest, right? I mean, you can you can turn livestock in there, and you can actually reduce the invasive species. The converse can be true when you have other types of invasive species that spread when the desirable plants are grazed, that if they're undesirable. Well, anyway, so the extended long-term type of just turning cattle in the woods can give you a cooler environment in the summer for livestock, just like we said. And in trade-off for that, you have a transport of pasture nutrients to the forested loafing areas. You have a concentration of livestock parasites, bacteria, disease organisms. You have tree mortality, especially with certain species when you have high-density stocking. You have degraded understory and resultant increase in erosion, diminished or eliminated regeneration of your high-quality trees, and reduced timber value due to physical damage and increased insect damage and increased disease due to root damage. So, not a good trade-off. And oddly enough, that's what we see happen more often than the good stuff, right? So, if we think about it, we can just say, we can turn our back to that and say, well, we don't care that most of y'all are doing all the wrong things. We only care that you do the right thing. Or we can say, I'd like to work with you to move you from here in the dark zone. Let's move you up to the white zone to begin with, while we work on some other things like maybe some temporary shade structures while we get some, either maybe a block planting somewhere to provide shade in a pasture, or some silvopasture or something that will be managed properly. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to work with people who are just turning cattle in the woods. Well, what perhaps is this is one of those things that kind of keeps me going, is the fact that people like W.J.A. Payne in 1984 mentioned that there's a search for viable systems that can exploit the possibilities that integration like silvopasture can offer. Okay, this is these next photographs are kind of in a sequence: loblolly pine with bahia grass and crimson clover, and it's a 1993 tree planting that we did on our farm in Alachua County, Florida. And here's my oldest son a little bit later pruning the trees. We had to keep up with the pruning on them, of course, because they were planted in an open type of a circumstance. But I would mention that with our management system, which was an intensive grazing management, I think we had 23 head of cattle, and we rotated them through like a 2-acre, temporary fence that we would put up and rotate them and move them on about a 3-day basis. So it was very intensively managed, but we did not protect these loblolly trees. We simply allowed them to be there. And the cattle, they weren't interested in them. I mean, they weren't interested in grazing them. Once in a while, they might stomp one, but they didn't really cause us any significant damage that bothered us. And so here, this is, again, still that same planting. This was in 1993. I tried to take the photographs from the same angle so that there would be a little bit of a comparison. This photo was in November of 2005. And so a little bit of math, that's about a 12-and-a-half-year-old stand where we had, I think that was after, yeah. Well, okay, you see the marking at the ground? We did our marking on the keep trees. We always mark the trees we like to keep, because that's what we always had our consulting foresters do too. But anyway, so we had harvested chip and saw from this location, from 12 to 14-inch loblolly pines that, yes, there's less rings per acre. I mean, less rings per inch on the in the timber value. So for a 2x12, it would be slightly less strong. Conversely, it has no knots, so there's not any knot breaking points. And also, if you think about it from a peeler log or something like that, you're looking at clear wood. And also for molding, people really like this. I can tell you that Weyerhaeuser and other large companies manage timber just like this, sends the cattle in a lot of cases, or with the cattle, just depending on their particular circumstance, for specialty lumber, molding, anything that they want to have clear, because everything outside of that 4-inch bowl is all clear. There's no knots in it whatsoever. I'm running out of time rapidly, so I'm going to zip through this pretty quickly, but some of the other studies, like the Standiford and Howitt study in '93, showed that managing for livestock, firewood, and commercial hunting nearly doubled the expected net present value over managing for livestock alone. I will tell you, I cherry pick my stuff that I put up here on the board, because there's other stuff that's not as good. But once again, by and large, there is great advantages to silvopasture. This is the folks in the right hand here. This is kind of a mentor of mine from North Kentucky that pioneered really a lot in the hardwood nut tree silvopasture. And you'll find, in fact, there's an article that I have in the Inside Agroforestry edition here that you can look up on the internet if you're interested in nut tree type performance. This is this is the same girl that was in that pine tree photograph. This is Amanda. She's my second young'un, and Amanda is she's recording the labels on the trees that we planted and kind of going through and checking on them. These are nut producing grafted trees, and we planted I think 400 nut producing trees on our place in Kentucky. We planted them in 08, 09, and 10. A lot of them required replants, and we had quite a bit of mortality, I'd say in the 55 to 60 percentile range from the original 300 some odd trees that we planted. But there's I think good interest. If you're not familiar with some of these, it takes. This is a dream sheet, you know, just like Chris's dream silvopasture. This is a dream sheet on nut producing, because this is in best conditions. We didn't plant these trees with you know, the normal tree planting methodology. We got them in the ground. These are bare root plants that we got in the ground as quick as we could, and put a lot of water on them, and then let them take off or die, pretty much. But just because of the scope and the scale. But those are some of the, and this, I think this will be, Chris, won't this be on the website, or you'll have this available so you can see those charts. And if you're not familiar with like heart nuts, that's heart nuts in the lower picture there, Japanese heart nuts. We planted some Japanese heart nuts intermingled with these. And then up in the upper left, you see, that is an improved black walnut. All these black walnut trees that are for nut production are improved. And I would recommend that you that you for sure use improved nut producing trees. These have like 40 to 42% nut fill, whereas common native black walnut will be about 9. And so they're a completely different class, really, of a walnut. It takes a lot of care when you're herbiciding in between. What we are doing here actually basically is, in this case, we're preparing to convert some of this into alley cropping, which is a good way to get, and that's the same field right there on the left. They're a whole lot of fun taking care of the Japanese beetle control. And then another pretty good quote, Silvopasture had a rate of return of 14.6%. Whereas the cattle systems in this particular research by Lundgren had 12.9% rate of return, and the pine plantation was 13.4%. So it's not like finding the pot at the end of the rainbow, you know, but every percent that you can lift your rate of return, you know, including your labor that you put in it. Here's our other son, Will, inspecting and flagging some trees, some white pine silvopasture that we put in. Now, I mentioned that with the this is a little later. He's protecting the trees for us in a grazing program. I did mention that we planted the loblolly pine without tree protection. We also planted all of the longleafs that we've ever planted. We either didn't use protection or we just used hay harvest up front, depending on the intensity that was intended for those. If it's intensively managed and watched carefully, you can usually get by a lot of times without tree protection if you can stand some loss, which you can always pretty much stand. White pine are feed. I mean, cattle love these things. Deer love them. Mammals love white pine, and they will go after them. So you have to protect them to some degree if you want. Yeah, this is a kind of interesting thought here. I can't think of his name. A professor at Auburn University brought a group of Germans to our place to look at silvopasture, to get some kind of an idea. Of course, they didn't speak any English or anything, and there was about 15 or so, and they were, speaking German gibberish, of course, to the professor. And so I asked him, I said, well, exactly what is it they're asking? And he said, when you translate it, it's something like, why would anybody do this? And I thought, well, the neighbors have the answer because they've been saying I'm crazy for years, I would say. And we established at the beginning of this talk that experience is what you get when you don't get what you wanted to get. So know that forage quality can be compromised if you're not careful. Here we're talking about autumn drought, reduced cool season growth this year. For the first time we've had really a high needle fall. It resulted in some reduced consumption. And just a side note, there's a larger component of agroforestry outside the bounds of Virginia and traditional stuff that we do. I had the privilege of working with these folks for weed management and planting some forages and a grazing, rotational grazing system for this particular location. That's Chromalina. Oh, it probably not too good in here, but that's Chromalina in the background's kind of infested this paspalum-based pasture that they had. Oh, one thing I might mention is too, you know, we worked it out so they could time the grazing management so that as they could graze down pretty low when they're going into harvest what are those things? Coconuts. Thank you. Okay, I'm old. Give me a break. All right. Silvopasture has been a lot of work down through the years. A lot of planning is necessary when you're beginning with ongoing managed pastures. But it's been nice for me, and I think it's not for everybody, but it's for a whole lot more people really than are using it now. And so that's, I think, where we come. I think that's where we come in as professionals to help people to see the opportunity there, and you know, kind of give them the best understanding we can, point them in the right direction, but to begin working to the degree we can with the folks who are just turning cattle in the woods, because those are the people we need to work with, not the avid silvopastoralist. It's the folks that are doing all their own things, and when they get ready to harvest timber, they're going to find hollow trees, they're going to, you know, and so forth. So let's work with those folks and try to bring them up from just turning cattle in the woods, bring them up a little at a time, bringing them up to just a brief term in the woods, and then move them up towards something like block planting, silvopasture, different things that they could use to get permanent accounting for the benefits, those ecosystem benefits that they're wanting to get and don't know how. Chris?
Hey, I will tell you that when I had Sid over to look at our silvopasture area that we're about to go out to, I showed him some riparian buffers that we get established along some of our riparian areas. And remember, he's the what was your title again?
Rangeland Management Specialist.
Yeah, and he looked at these riparian area buffers and said, "You're going to graze those, right?" And I'm like, "Where's this guy coming from?" But he's real practical, and he's got a great experience, and hopefully we'll get to visit more as we go out to the field. Is there any questions now for Sid?
Wagon should be out there, Doc.
Okay.
That wasn't a question. You had asked about, you and you're back, or you might not have left, but you never left. Okay. You had asked about the you know, growth, and are you sacrificing growth? And those 12-and-a-half-year-old trees that we harvested for chip and saw that's a typical 20 to 30 year time frame to get them there, with normal plantings of 650 to 900 trees per acre, and I account for it through fertilizer. There was lime. I don't know if the lime was helping all that much, but there was fertilizer applications for the pasture on a regular, ongoing basis. There was no competition from other plants, and the trees were planted in a more open format where there was very low tree-to-tree competition until they were ready to harvest.